All right, hey guys, this is the fourth lesson. This is over Jonah chapter 2. I don't know where everybody is, but right now it is March 1st. I should have material, just to let you know. Well, the material in Jonah with a wrap-up lesson, if you're doing one lesson a week, will take you up through Easter. So, just to give you an idea, on April 3rd, we're going to have one service only. That's Doug's anniversary day. That day, his 30th anniversary. So we'll be having one service at 10 and no Sunday school classes that day. So that'll be a skip day. And then the material will go the next weekend, which is the 10th, which will be Palm Sunday. That should be your final. If you're staying up at this, it would be, if you're staying a lesson a week and up to where I am, it would be the final kind of wrap-up lesson for Jonah. And then Easter, my plan is to have all the Sunday school classes meet together, do breakfast, and do an Easter lesson. And I'll probably be texting you guys just asking for any input on what to do afterwards. So anyhow, let's get going. Of course, last week's lesson, we finished up chapter 1. And went through, the sailors casting the lots and falling on Jonah, asking him a bunch of questions and him not really answering them. But anyhow, the idea, the big picture that came out of last week for me is the way that the author uses the phrase fear and kind of describing the process that the sailors go through to where they initially believe in their gods and are praying to them too. At the end of chapter 1, they're actually praying to the Lord and fearing the Lord and making sacrifices and vows to Him. And it's kind of interesting just to trace that. I hope you did. And, of course, Jonah, as we'll talk about this week, really didn't do anything with that. So that's kind of the big point. And the idea of, I really feel like that. The big theological idea to come out of last week's is this idea of the scapegoat. We talked about they would cast the lots on the two goats on Yom Kippur Day. One goat would be the scapegoat. All the sins of the people would be laid upon that goat, taken outside of the city, released. The other goat is sacrificed. So you have this idea of two goats. But under Jonah is the first time that we see this. Like we've talked about in the past, the Bible is, even though it's made up of a bunch of different narratives and poetry and things like that, has one big overarching meta-narrative. No offense to Mr. Zuckerberg, but he doesn't own that term, meta. God created that. But anyhow, this idea that, as we see with Jonah, he's both the scapegoat and the sacrifice. And of course, that will be really brought out with Christ, who all the sins of the world are placed upon, and he's also the sacrifice to pay the penalty for those sins. So hopefully, you had a good discussion on that. So this week we're kind of going to look at an idea of repentance. Once again, talked about in the past as we go through this. As the Jews came out of captivity and began to be able to do sacrifices again and hold their holidays, one of the things they identified while they were in captivity is that, they didn't read the Bible enough. And so one of the things they did is identify a particular book of the Old Testament to be read during each of the major holidays. Excuse me. And of course, I talked about how Jonah is the one that is read on Yom Kippur, and which contains the Day of Atonement. And so I was, early on looking and seeing why it was done, and I found this answer by a Jewish scholar, which I thought was really good. He says there's really four main reasons, there for why read Jonah during Yom Kippur. The first one is it reminds us of God's infinite mercy. Jonah is read to remind us that if God could forgive Nineveh, God can forgive us. And I think that could be a good discussion point. This idea, sometimes people hold on to their sin. They may realize they've been forgiven, but sometimes they don't act like it. And it can be a big deal for some people when they look back at their life and they think there's no way I can be forgiven. So this kind of points that out. Second point has to do with how the day and its theme should be observed. Just as the people fasted in Nineveh, so Jews will fast on Yom Kippur, and they will go through that as a study. So, we don't fast that much in our society, especially as a whole, but the Jews still do in that context. And then I think number 3, the book serves as a reminder that the entire world is in God's hand. Think back to the little song we all learn. It's got the whole world in his hands, but you see in Jonah, you see the wind, the sea, animals, plants, people, all these things, very Genesis in its nature. Just a reminder that everything is God's world. And, the final one, as one hears the story of Jonah's prayer being answered from the belly of the fish, the prayers of the sailor, and later the prayers of the Ninevites, we should also be reminded to pray for our own deliverance. And then that's a salvation issue or just maybe a sin issue. And through that, and too often we don't think about prayer until it's too late. Good discussion point there about, too often we try to exhaust everything we can think of, and then when worse comes to worse, we'll pray. So hopefully you get some good discussion out of those. I thought they were very good takes on the book of Jonah and how it correlates to, atonement and repentance and those things. So let's get in the book. We're looking at chapter 2. Just remember that it starts in chapter 1, verse 17. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Of course, Jonah's thrown overboard. He's sinking, and God appoints this fish. And appoints, like I put there, a few different meanings. It could be prepared, governed, arranged, but also created, which is what God seems to do in this case with the fish. It could have been some other fish, but it almost looks like he brings it out specifically to do this. That word appoint will be used 3 other times in the story of Jonah. Chapter 4, God will appoint a plant or vine to grow over Jonah and shade him. Then God appoints a worm to eat that plant. And, finally he appoints an east wind to blow on Jonah. So you get a lot of references back to Genesis and other parts of the Bible connections. You think of the east wind that God sent to part the sea and to dry it up. So what we see in here is that last point, we see in these God's active participation in Jonah's life and story. And I think this should, good discussion point. What does this make us think about God's involvement in our own stories? A lot of times we don't see it when it's actually happening, but, in hindsight, we can look back and see how God has worked in our lives. So, hopefully some good discussion point. The fish itself, the Hebrew word is simply for a fish. They weren't really a seagoing people, and also they really didn't have the biological knowledge that we have of a whale versus a fish. So the word is just a fish, but it's more than just a fish. And here's an important point. Notice that Jonah swallowed up twice at this point. He swallowed up when the waters close in over his head. And then the fish comes and swallows him, but that's actually Jonah's salvation is the fish swallowing him. And you think about this has happened to the Jewish people before, right? You think about when they go through the Red Sea. They had been swallowed up by Egypt, and now they're coming out, but Pharaoh's right behind them, threatening to take them back again, in a sense, swallow them up, and God, parts the sea, where they are able to walk through, and the sea doesn't close in on them, but it does close in on the Egyptians. So this idea of God has saved us through, and even to a certain extent when the Jewish people cross into the promised land across the river Jordan, that God dries up also. So and then more, I guess, in a philosophical sense or metaphysical sense, I guess, that you're looking at, especially the kingdom of Israel at this time, the threat that they were going to be swallowed up and by Nineveh. And the Jeremiah quote's really good. The Psalm quote, really good. They talk about how, to be overcome by your enemies is to be swallowed up. The Jeremiah one's really good, talking about that. And, And the idea is that so God appoints the fish to save Jonah, and this idea carries up as God will, in a sense, they are being swallowed up by Nineveh. They're being conquered. And in a sense, that's a horrible thing. I mean, you look at Lamentations and the description of sieges, and they're horrible. But in a sense, God is saving his people by allowing them to be taken out of Israel, where they are steeped in sin. I mean, you read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, and it's just one bad king after another. They're worshiping, idols. They're worshiping the gods of the people around them, and their sin is so great that God's like, you can't be here anymore. You have to go out. And it's during the exile that they begin to see things. You look at the book of Daniel, at the book of Esther, and these books that are written during the exile, Ezekiel, they begin to grow closer to God. And when they come out, they are ready to a certain extent, begin to live in the land again. So this idea of exile being swallowed up is one that carries throughout the whole Bible. And, it's interesting. You think about the Jewish people up until 1947, from basically 69 AD, so almost 2,000 years, have been in exile throughout the world. And to my knowledge, I can't think of another ethnic group that has been so long away from being a country and still maintain their ethnic identity. You can still see God's hands on Jewish people to this day. Now, argument over what that means, we don't think we need to get into it, but God has protected his people. So maybe some good discussion about this, how God will do that. And we look at Christians. I mean, the church, the early church, is protected by the Romans, and the very people who are, in one sense, and some of them are going after them and persecuting the church, but at the same point in time, they are protected from the forces of the outside world by the just the security that Rome at that point provides. So, same point for us. You think of the fish again. I put it there. That early symbol that the early Christians had of drawing the fish in the sand, and the other person would draw the other part, and they had the name ichthus in Greek that had been, each letter stood for a certain thing, and that was kind of their way of identifying each other. And then finally you look at it, this idea that even if America were to fall or becomes just wholly evil, God's going to protect his church. I mean, how many times has a church been protected? I mean, you look at places like Egypt and North Africa, Tunisia, Libya, all these countries. You go back 1,500 years ago, that was all Christian area. But when the Muslims came, they conquered that. But even, as it opened back up, we saw that the church has still survived in those areas. So we need to keep that in mind, that sometimes God will take us into captivity or exile, like he does Jonah, to give people a time to think and possibly repent. So hopefully some good discussion about that. And then, of course, we have the image of baptism here, being buried in water and brought back to new life. Being a Baptist, we can talk about that. No sprinkling going on here. And then the idea of the fish right there at the end, it does go back and forth between masculine and changes to feminine. A lot of discussion out there. You can look at some of that yourself. Some commentators just kind of don't want to talk about it. Some say, it does kind of give us this idea that Jonah was reborn. It says vomited out, but that word could mean other things. So, and then the final thing there is the 3 days and 3 nights, the sign of Jonah. And of course, I think this is a very important point to make. Jesus refers to this sign in Matthew and Luke and alludes to it in the book of Mark. And if you look at Matthew 16, 1 through 4, I think is probably the best one. You can see that they want a sign from heaven. And, Jesus had just finished healing many people and feeding the multitudes. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees come to him, and they want another sign. They want him to do a miracle, one command. And Jesus says, no. He says, you know what? You can look up at the sky, and you can tell what the weather's going to be. You know the signs. And if you know that, then you know the other thing. So he says, you won't get any more signs from me. I will do miracles for other people, but none for me. I am basically the sign of Jonah. And if you think about Jonah as we see him in the story, you see two separate groups of people brought to a point of worshiping God and repentance, the sailors, and then later on the city of Nineveh, and all with Jonah kind of as the central character. But what does Jonah do? He doesn't do any miracles. He doesn't pray. He just says the bare minimum, and he's just there. And but yet, these people believed God and they repented, and so that's the point, that you're not getting. Jonah didn't do any signs, but you look at Jonah. Even the Ninevites responded to that. That's Jesus's point. Even with no signs, they responded. Why can't God's people respond to such a sign? So, I think those are good points to be brought up. Jesus, like Jonah, was dead for 3 days, except for the differences. Jonah came out of the fish alive, but he will die again, whereas Jesus does not. So, I think the sign of Jonah, the big thing to talk about is just that, Jonah does nothing and people come to salvation. And what do these guys want? They're in Matthew and over in Luke. The Sadducees and the Pharisees are seeing these great signs and they want more. And, maybe a good discussion on this is just the idea of, we see miracles sometimes in our own lives, but, or a lot of times we'll say, well, if God would just do something big, that would make a difference. But, the Bible and history kind of prove that's not the case. You think back to the Exodus. They're getting fed every day. Their clothes are not wearing out. They're following, a cloud in the morning and a fire at night. And they're seeing all these things happen, and they continue to gripe. We want water. We want meat. We want this. And we're not a lot different, because those things, even though they're amazing, can become mundane because of the way our mind works. So, good points to talk about. The actual prayer itself, just got some notes on that. Have the class read it, and what are some of the ways that Jonah describes his situation. That, to me, the prayer, it is poetry, drawn mostly from the book of Psalms. And I put there in the reflection and discussion part there under the prayer, in final distress and despair, Jonah falls back on what he knows, which were the Psalms, the prayer book of the Hebrew people. It's sort of a simple prayer, given the extraordinary trouble he's in. But as one commentator put it, I like it. God gave them the Psalms. They were what they were to use to pray, and that's what he used. And in a sense, this, even though it seems an extraordinary amount of stress in to God, is it? No. He actually appointed that fish, so that fish is only going to do what God appointed it to do. The thing to remember, I think, from this is that we can use this same type of praying. We can go to the Psalms. We don't have to just try to make up stuff and come up with stuff off the top of our heads. And it's a good discussion about praying the Psalms or the prayers. And that's why we did the meditation one over Psalm 1 and Psalm 23. Good ones to think about. It's interesting to note that it's not a request to be saved from the fish. His prayer isn't, but it's a thanksgiving for being saved by the fish. Jonah knows what's going on. He says, I prayed to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Now, to us, it seems like a weird way to answer him, but it does. He does know. And then, one might finally say that, finally Jonah's praying here. He didn't pray for the sailors, didn't pray for that situation. And it's interesting in verse 4, he says, I am driven away from your sight. And a kind of an anguish. But if you think back to verse, chapter 1, what does he want to do? He wants to escape God. So, he's kind of there. He finds out it isn't really what he wanted. And then it's interesting in verse 7 that, he makes the point of, that he was fainting away. He was about to die. He remembered God, which is interesting because Jonah's just kind of flirting with suicide this whole time. Wants to be thrown off ship. Later on, asks God to kill him. And then in verse 9, he finally gets to the point where the sailors had come much earlier. He is now willing to sacrifice and bow to God. You think about his prayer, in a sense, it comes too late. If Jonah would have prayed this prayer on board the ship and asked God to stop the storm so he could go back and do it, you wonder, would God have stopped it? You think about the sailors that are above him somewhere. They're celebrating God's goodness with sacrifices and vows, and Jonah is just now, after almost drowning and having to be swallowed by fish, getting to that point. And so I think some good reflection and discussion from this would be, how often do we wait as long as Jonah did before praying? And only pray when our own efforts are just exhausted. And would you say that this poem is showing as Jonah is repentant? And if so, repentant of what? And, last question, why do you think God chose this way to save Jonah? So I think, you got some great opportunities for discussion here. You go back to the 4 reasons. We took a closer look at the fish that swallowed Jonah and talked about some of the deeper meanings associated with this. We talked about the 3 days and 3 nights, and we looked at Jonah's poem and kind of went through it. There's a lot of good commentary out there. You can probably go and maybe talk about, where did he get this poem from? The fact that he had these things memorized so well that he could pull them from different psalms and other books to make this poem and this prayer so quickly. So so I hope it's a good lesson so far. I think you got a lot to talk about. It's taken me about 22 minutes to do this. So good opportunity for some good discussion in the class. So anyhow, next week it's on to getting vomited out of the fish's mouth. So talk to you later.